So this is, well, you're probably familiar with this building, but during the 1893 fair, this was the Palace of Fine Arts. And of course, now it's a Museum of Science and Industry. So the building is about 99% the same as it was back in 1893, except that back in 1893, it was covered with staff. So if you're aware of, most of the big buildings that you saw during the fair were wooden buildings that were covered in like a plaster of Paris to make them look like granite, and then they were spray painted white. Spray painting came from the fair. That was a first. So Frank Millett, who was in charge of decoration, as you know, they pretty much pulled this whole thing off in about 2 years to transform Jackson Park from pretty much swamp into a World's Fair. So they didn't have a lot of time. When you consider Chicago winters, it was really kind of crazy. So once these buildings were built and the staff, all the artists were making all the statues and whatnot out of staff, they're like, how are we going to get all this painted with paintbrushes and a bunch of guys on scaffolding? It's going to take forever. So Frank Millett, who actually died on the Titanic, was in charge of the decorations for the fair. And he said, why don't we just put a big fire hose in a 55-gallon drum of our best white lead-based paint, and we spray it on the buildings, you know, just like a fire hose would put it on, and that's where it came from. So that's where spray painting came from. So the mother of necessity, the mother of invention. So what they did is they later, well, we'll get to that in a second, but Charles B. Atwood is the architect who designed it. He became Daniel Burnham's kind of second-hand man once Root had passed away shortly before the fair opened. This is what it looked like on the inside. So the Palace of Fine Arts they were bringing artwork from all over the world to the World's Fair, statues, paintings, whatnot. We're going to come back to the statue of Ball because I like to kind of trace these things and find out where they went and where you could still see them. Now, after the fair, since this building was semi-permanent, and the reason it was semi-permanent is because since it was housing all the artwork, they had to make it fireproof. So they couldn't make it out of wood and cover it with staff because they couldn't get insurance. So we didn't have, in 1893, by that time it was only 20 years after the Great Fire, and we didn't have a good track record with fires. So when we went to get fire insurance for all this priceless works of art, they said, yeah, you're not going to build it out of wood. So they built it out of house brick and covered it with staff. So because of that, it was more permanent than the rest of the buildings. After the fair was over, this became what is now the Museum of Science and Industry, really became the Field Museum. It was actually the Field Museum first, called the Field Columbian Museum. And what they did is they took most of the stuff that was left over from the anthropological building, which was also designed by Atwood, that was on the south side of the fair. That was stuff like, you know, taxidermied animals, squids, woolly mammoths. You can see that they moved it inside here once it became the Field Columbian Museum. They moved it inside of this building. You're going to see a lot of stuff that looks familiar, kind of like the Field Museum now, because most of those taxidermied animals that you see at the Field Museum were from the Columbian Exposition. Now, in 1922, they built the Field Museum where it is now, and the Field Museum on the south, now the Museum of Science and Industry, became vacant. You can see the house bricks in this slide. So after a while, if you don't keep up the staff, it just falls apart. And that's what was going on, is this building was kind of falling apart. So they moved everything to where the new Field Museum is by truck on rail cars. So they fitted these trucks with railroad wheels. And they also ran trains to they ran special tracks all the way up to the Field Museum and moved things by train.